Hey everyone. In today's video, we're going to do something a little different. What we're going to do is look at how to organize your Power Automate cloud flows. And this is just an example of what I do to keep my flows organized for the purpose of my own documentation, but also because these are flows that my team uses as well. So when I create a flow and I share it with my team or my organization, this is how I put together documentation on it. So when I'm building a flow, I will build the flow along with a Visio flowchart. And that's documentation for stakeholders to know how the flow works without them needing to have access to the actual flow to see what's happening. And then I also document, keeping everything in the Microsoft sphere. I also document using OneNote. And so I'm going to show you exactly how I do that. So what you're seeing right here is my list of cloud flows that are shared with my team. And in OneNote, I have a page, and I just have the page in a section that's called Power Automate. And the first page in this section is active cloud flows. And I've got a little description here that says these are the active Power Automate flows that we maintain. And if you click on this link here, it's going to take you right to the page that we were just on, which is the shared flows page here. And if we go back to OneNote, a little description that says clicking on the flow name link sends you to the Power Automate Cloud Flow description. So what that means is that this is the list of flows here. And if I actually click on the name of the flow, which is, like, for example, this first one right here, I click on it, that's going to send me again to Power Automate, and it's going to send me to the flow description page. So in this way, I create a description for each flow within the description under the details section of the actual flow page here. So you can read the description here. That way I'm not duplicating, right? I can keep it on this page here, but I'm not gonna actually put the description of the flow on this page here. So the name of the flow matches here, 301 review content. It matches the name of the actual flow here. And that's to keep everything nice and clean and organized, straightforward and uniform. On this page, I also have it set up here with a description of the trigger. And of course, another way to do that is actually just put the description of the trigger in the description on the page here. But I like to have the description of the trigger here because in some cases, the description here is a little bit more less details, although I do mention what the trigger is here, but I elaborate it further here, explaining the actual, if it's triggered from an email, what the email address is, if there's an Outlook rule involved, what the name of that Outlook rule is, those kind of details, right? And then another thing here that I like to include is the frequency. So how often does the flow run? So if it's triggered by an email, right, it's gonna run whenever an email is sent, right, or received. And if it's something that's specific to, like, the trigger is a report that comes out of one system every once a month, then it'll say once a month. And then the last thing I include in my little synopsis of the flow is the flow chart. And I name my flow charts, again, the same name as the flow name to keep everything uniform. So I link to it here. And this link, actually, it doesn't take me to Visio. Instead, it takes me to a subpage. You can see over here, we were up here, and now it took us down here. And so how I have this organized is, as you can see, my cloud flows are organized by different categories. So all of the flows listed under learner notifications are related to learner notifications. And if you look over on the side here, you'll see these pages here these are essentially what we could call components. So this component here doesn't have any description, but that's because everything under this component, flowcharts, training subscriptions, is the flowchart of that category. So underneath flowcharts, training subscriptions, you're going to see the subpages or subcomponents of training subscriptions flowcharts. So you can get to them, of course, simply by going over here, and then you'll see the diagram there, or you can click here and it will take you to that component, subcomponent, and we can see we're now under flowcharts learner notifications. And we're on this page, and what this diagram is here, this is actually just a snapshot of the Visio diagram. And so how I set that up is I create the flowchart in Visio, and then what I do is I save it, and I just save it to SharePoint so that anybody can see it. My whole team can see it. And then I just put a little link over here, original Visio flowchart file. And if I click on that, it's going to take me to SharePoint, right to that Visio flowchart. And then from here, I'm able to edit this diagram here. And if I go back here, this is actually just a snapshot or a screenshot of the same thing that you're seeing right here. So that's how I organize my flowcharts. And if we go back to Cloudflow's page, the other thing that you can see is that some have a few extra details, those what I call sub details. So in some cases, there is another header under the trigger called Saba notification. And the reason for that is because there's additional details regarding that trigger, right? Because the trigger for the flow is not actually the start of the entire process flow. The start of the Power Automate or the Power Automate trigger is actually when an email is received to an inbox. That's what triggers the Power Automate flow, but that's not the whole flow. The flow actually is starting outside of Power Automate, and it's starting by, in this example, it's starting by an LMS sending a email to the inbox, and that email has a attached report. And that email that the LMS is sending is based on a schedule. So there's some stuff that's automated that's happening outside of Power Automate, and I'm explaining that here as well, so that everyone has all the detail necessary to know how the flow begins. And again, in some cases, the flow is starting outside of Power Automate. So it might go through a few different steps before Power Automate is triggered, but everything is still automated before that. So another example would be that the report is on a schedule. So I'm not doing anything to send the report. It's just when it hits a certain date, the system sends the email. And then when Outlook receives the email, Outlook is actually running a rule to send that email to a subfolder. And then that is triggering Power Automate because it's based on the email being sent to a certain subfolder. So there's actually two automated steps prior to Power Automate running the flow. So make sure that you document all of that as well, because if there's something that needs repair, it might be something like the flow is not running. Well, why isn't my flow running? Well, that's because there's actually steps outside of Power Automate that are happening, and you need to have all of that documented. So I'm documenting all of that in OneNote and structuring it with these components so that I don't have one page that's just a massive amount of information, but it's broken down into these components here for flowcharts. And again, you could call the flow name linking to the Power Automate page, which is another component of the documentation. So I wanted to share that with you, and hopefully something in here you find useful. I would also like to hear what process you use for creating your documentation, and how we can all work together to streamline our documentation and making it easier as time goes on. I plan to, incorporate some automation for putting together my documentation. So for example, when I create a new flow, a lot of the documentation will be automated. And so if you're doing that already, I would love to hear more about that. So please feel free to post below. And again, I'll see you in the next video. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.